It was a chilly February day in 1981 when Deanie Peters, just 14 years old, stepped away from her brother's wrestling practice to use the bathroom at Forest Hills Central Middle School in Ada, Michigan. She would never be seen again. Today, nearly 40 years later, what happened to Deanie Peters remains a mystery. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that weave together paranormal aspects with murder mysteries, and they are all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com or at jrericksonauthor.com. They are in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Just a couple of quick things before I start today's episode. I want to apologize, as I so frequently do at the beginning of these episodes, for letting more than a month elapse since my previous episode. My father passed away about 2 weeks ago, and though I don't think I have mentioned this previously on the podcast, he has been battling stage 4 lung cancer for the last year. And so my family has really taken a precedence over most of the things in my life. And then my writing tends to come second, and this podcast has really shifted to the back burner during that time. So again, I apologize for the long period of time between episodes, and I do hope to have a bi-weekly regular schedule at some point in the future. Thanks so much for listening today, and if you celebrate them, have a happy holiday season. There's something about disappearances that stick with us. The eerie sense that a person was there and suddenly they're gone without a trace. In the case of 14-year-old Deanie Peters, it's hard not to feel unnerved, perhaps even frightened, by the girl's mysterious vanishing. Deanie Peters, legal name Dean, was born on September 24th, 1966 in Bellflower, California, to parents Dwayne and Mary Pyle. They made their home in Paramount, California. However, their intact family ended just 2 years later when Dwayne and Mary divorced. Mary took Deanie back to Bellflower, where they lived with Mary's parents. Deanie's father moved to Cerritos, California. Mary later married John Peters. Together, he, Mary, and Deanie moved to Whittier, California, and Deanie began attending school. Eventually, John and Mary had a child together, a son named William. The family of 4 moved to Poway, California, where Deanie started going to Lutheran school. During this time, Deanie's stepfather was working for an organization that merged with another company, offering him a better job opportunity if he relocated to Grand Rapids, Michigan. In 1979, John and his family moved to Cascade, Michigan, a suburb of Grand Rapids located just over 10 miles from the city. This would prove to be a fateful choice, as only 2 years later, Deanie would disappear. By all accounts, Deanie was a relatively happy 14-year-old girl. She was pretty, with brown hair and deep-set brown eyes. She was attending 8th grade in February of 1981. She went to school in Ada, Michigan, another Grand Rapids suburb, known for its historic covered bridge which crossed the Thornapple River. According to a letter Deanie wrote her dad, who was still in California, she missed him, and the Christmas and New Year's holidays had brought back memories that made her wish she was closer to him and her other siblings. By this, I'm assuming that her biological father, Dwayne, had had other children, maybe with a future wife. She also mentioned she had a boyfriend named Larry, but who was known as Guy, and that everyone in the school knew about her dad and how great he was. It's a sweet letter and offers a glimpse into Deanie's thoughts in the weeks before she disappeared. Despite Deanie's seeming contentedness in her current life, I think it's safe to say it wasn't picture perfect. She'd moved away from her biological father and was longing for that former life. Her friends said she spoke of wanting to return to California to live with her biological dad, and that she wasn't crazy about her stepfather, John. I also read a report that she smoked cigarettes, and while this doesn't offer any deep insights into Deanie's personality, this would have indicated that she was comfortable doing things that broke the rules, at least on some level. I remember myself at 14, and it's the time in life when we often really start pushing boundaries. There's a sense of becoming an individual, of breaking away from our families. I, too, experimented with cigarettes at this age, as well as other drugs and alcohol. And I say all this only to point out that, in my opinion, these are pretty natural behaviors in the early teen years. I also want to mention Deanie's boyfriend, Guy Dalkey. He was not a fellow 14-year-old. He was actually 17 at the time that he and Deanie were dating, and he was working rather than going to school. Again, this isn't necessarily outside of the norm. However, I think it's important to note. The area where Deanie's family lived, as well as Ada, where she went to school, were small, family-focused Michigan towns. In 1981, the world still moved at a slower pace, and I doubt anyone could imagine a safer place than a people-filled gymnasium at the local middle school. It's these things that make Deanie's disappearance all the more disturbing. On February 5th, Deanie's mother, Mary, asked Deanie if she wanted to go with her to the Forest Hills Central Middle School, where Deanie's 4-year-old brother was attending a wrestling clinic for younger kids. Initially, Deanie said no, but then she changed her mind and tagged along to the school with her mom. Also, as a side note, this is the middle school where Deanie herself was an 8th grader. Just before 5 p.m., Deanie told her mother she was going to use the bathroom. She told her mother's friend, who was also in the gym, quote, "I'll be right back." She walked through the gymnasium and out the door. Deanie never arrived at the restroom, and these brief exchanges between her mother and her mother's friend would be the last known contact anyone had with Deanie Peters. As time passed, Deanie's mother started to grow anxious. Eventually, she began reaching out to Deanie's friends, and when no one had seen the 14-year-old girl, the police were summoned. It seemed unlikely Deanie had left of her own accord. However, investigators initially hoped she was a runaway. After all, Deanie missed her father in California, and police wondered if she might have tried to somehow get back to where he was. They pretty quickly lost hope in this scenario, however, as Deanie had left behind all of her belongings except the clothes that were on her back. Her purse was at her bedroom in Cascade, which also held several $100s in money she'd received for Christmas. Her clothes were in her bedroom, her jewelry, and her other personal items. And remember, again, this is 1981. A few $100s is a lot of money, especially for a 14-year-old. Investigators also contacted Deanie's friends and family, but no one had had any contact with her after she left the gymnasium. A 14-year-old would leave some kind of trace if she ran away. Someone would have known something, and yet they couldn't find anyone who'd spoken with or seen her. A large search was soon underway. Police searched the school, and along with volunteers, they searched the surrounding area, which included woods that bordered the school campus. And the school campus for the middle school was adjoined by the high school. So this was one larger school campus with both the high school and the middle school on the same piece of property. A helicopter was used to search by air. The sheriff's department asked the public to contact them if they'd seen Deanie the day she went missing. They interviewed her friends, her boyfriend, her parents, and anyone who might have had contact with her. No one had heard from her. As I mentioned, the middle school shared a campus with the high school, and the evening that Deanie disappeared, there were multiple activities going on at these two schools. In addition to the kids' wrestling practice, there was also an aerobics class at the middle school, as well as a donkey basketball game at the Forest Hills Central High School. The search for Deanie Peters went on for 3 weeks and was officially suspended at the beginning of March 1981. Volunteers and law enforcement concluded their search with a 6-square-mile area of the Cannonsburg State Game Area. Investigators started taking a look at the school's custodian, Arthur Diaz, who was 40 years old in 1981, and he remembered Deanie, saying she was a, quote, sharp kid, a good-looking gal. He told investigators there were 3 high school-age boys banging on the doors of the school that afternoon, but Diaz wouldn't let them in because he didn't recognize them. One of them was wearing a green and white Forest Hills Central jacket. Later, Diaz said he was never asked to give descriptions of these boys, nor asked to look at mugshots by police. I'm not sure when information about the boys surfaced in the media. Both investigators with the sheriff's office and Deanie's parents would later say they didn't remember Diaz mentioning these 3 boys right after Deanie's disappearance. Police briefly theorized that Diaz may have murdered Deanie and burned her body in the gas-fired incinerator at the school, which was used to destroy food scraps and old school papers. However, further investigation proved the incinerator was not hot enough to destroy a body. It's also important to note that Diaz did not have a criminal history at this time, and his future criminal history would not occur until the 1990s and would mostly include drunk driving offenses. A month after Deanie vanished, detectives arrested Arthur Diaz, and he was forced to go in front of a secret grand jury. He spent one night in Kent County Jail and testified at the grand jury the following day. He was then released. I didn't find a whole lot of information about why Diaz was a suspect beyond the fact that he was a custodian at the school and would have had access to Deanie as well as places to hide her the night she vanished. In 1984, Diaz quit his job at the school for construction work. Before I get into the other suspects and theories in Deanie's case, I also want to mention that the schools did not shut down when Deanie disappeared. In fact, the very next day after Deanie went missing, both the middle school and the high school welcomed students. So if there had been evidence in the school, in the parking lot, it is possible that some of that evidence was obliterated by the cars and the people and the students coming in and out of the schools in the following days. Whether there was evidence or not, investigators did not find anything in their weeks of searching after Deanie disappeared. They did not find a trace of the girl, nor a confirmed sighting of her after she left to use the bathroom. Over the years, additional theories have emerged that have focused on Deanie's peers. There's an active Facebook page hosted by WZZM13 that regularly updates information about Deanie, and the comments beneath these updates highlight a lot of finger pointing amongst Deanie's former classmates and people she knew. Police have taken many of these rumors seriously, and over the years they've excavated multiple areas and drained a pond in search of Deanie's remains. I'm going to relay these rumors to the best of my ability, but I have to admit they were a bit convoluted and confusing at times. One theory, and seemingly the most popular, involves a man named Bruce Bunch, who was 17 at the time of Deanie's disappearance. He worked at a factory where Deanie's boyfriend, Guy, also worked in Lowell, Michigan. According to a 2006 MLive article, Bruce claimed to have dreamed about Deanie after watching news reports on her disappearance. He said he never knew her. He didn't remember details of the dream, but he claimed that when he told his friends about it, someone started a rumor that Bruce had killed Deanie. In a phone interview, he later said, quote, "When I was a kid, I used to have this mental telepathy thing. I could tell things, like when a bird comes into your house and tells you someone is going to die." This is Bruce's story of how the rumors began. Another story involves Bruce, or another man, telling friends at a keg party that he hit Deanie with his truck in the school parking lot while driving with two of his friends. The boys then took her body and buried her near an old schoolhouse so they wouldn't get in trouble. The schoolhouse story has been around since the early days of Deanie's vanishing. In that same 2006 MLive article, former Lowell Police Chief Barry Emmons said he'd received an anonymous tip about the schoolhouse shortly after Deanie's disappearance. He went to the site and looked around, but he did not find any evidence of Deanie's remains. In 2006, the area behind the former schoolhouse in Lowell, Michigan was excavated by investigators and anthropology students from Michigan State University. Using a backhoe, they dug an area approximately 30 feet by 50 feet and 4 feet deep. No signs of Deanie were found. And mind you, we're talking 2006. So this is 25 years after Deanie's disappearance, and they're still looking in sort of these same general areas that they were hearing about back in 1981. Another story, which seems intertwined with the Bruce Bunch story, involves a woman canoeing with friends in 1989. The woman later told journalists in an interview that a man she was with spoke about how he and two friends had struck a girl named Deanie in a parking lot and hid her body in his truck before later burying her along the Flat River. Apparently, Bruce was not among the boys this man claimed he was with that day. However, this woman's story seems to have gotten tangled up with the story about Bruce Bunch, which perhaps is how Bruce became considered the person who claimed to have hit Deanie and hid her body. Whether or not that's true, I do not know. One of the men allegedly involved in this scenario with Deanie, the second one told to the woman in the canoe, was a man named Joseph F., and we'll just leave his last name at F. He was questioned by detectives on 2 separate occasions, and he repeated the story that involved Bruce Bunch hitting Deanie in the school parking lot and burying her behind the schoolhouse in Lowell. However, he claimed that he knew this story secondhand. He was not in the truck or in any way involved in Deanie's disappearance. Joseph also said in this MLive article that detectives put a lot of pressure on him in this interview and even accused him, as well as his brother at one point, of running Deanie down at a park party. Joseph insisted he had nothing to do with Deanie's disappearance, and he admitted in the M Live article that it was quite scary to be accused of hitting her. The canoe story also compelled Kent County crime scene investigators, along with cadaver dogs, to the former Young Marines camp in Ionia County's Keene Township. This is an area not far from the one-room schoolhouse mentioned previously. Tony Schaefer, who owned and lived on the camp property with her husband, said detectives had searched and dug on multiple occasions looking for Deanie's body, but they found nothing. A psychic also visited the property and claimed a body had been stored there until the ground thawed enough to be buried. Bruce Bunch eventually relocated to Somerset, Kentucky, and he passed away in 2008 from natural causes. So I guess what I wonder is whether or not there's any truth to these rumors or stories, or are they simply gossip that through the years have merged and become a single story? As I read through these reports, I kept thinking of something my dad used to say: "What a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive." I think this is pretty rampant in Deanie's case, and one of the challenges is that people aren't necessarily intending to deceive anyone. They're simply passing along information they've heard, much of which likely originated with a rumor that spiraled out of control. I have more thoughts on this, but I'll come back to it later in the podcast. Deanie Peters was declared dead in 1992, 10 years after she went missing. On her death certificate, the word unknown is listed 15 times. It's a stark reminder of Deanie's final moments. What happened to her? Where did it happen? Who did it? All of these things are unknown. At the time of the death declaration, Kent County Sheriff Sergeant Ken Kleinhexel, I probably butchered that, who had investigated the case since she vanished, said he still thought of Deanie weekly and wished he could find something for the family. He also said he sent out Deanie's x-rays anytime an unidentified body was found in the United States in the hopes of finding her remains. Kleinhexel retired in 1993, and Sergeant Chet Bush took over the investigation. He interviewed over 50 people and considered more than a dozen suspects, but he wasn't able to get any solid leads in Deanie's case. In 2000, an FBI agent was hired to look into Deanie's unsolved disappearance. Eugene DeBault retired in 1999 from the FBI office in Grand Rapids and then was brought on in Kent County as a cold case investigator. He, too, had no luck uncovering what happened to Deanie Peters. In 2008, a cold case team started investigating Deanie's case. They interviewed hundreds of people and followed leads into 7 states, but nearly every tip and story led to a dead end. In 2009, Target 8 reported that Deanie's diary had gone missing from the Kent County Sheriff's Department. Cold case investigators subpoenaed Kent Kleinhexel, the original investigator on Deanie's case, to find out what happened to her diary, which he once had possession of. The cold case team had a theory that an altercation that occurred between Deanie and some of her female classmates, or potentially girls who were a little bit older than her, may have led to her disappearance. Kent said he'd studied the diary closely and found nothing in there. He claimed that he gave the diary to Deanie's mother, but she doesn't remember getting it. Kent also said there was miscommunication amongst detectives during the original investigation, which may have muddied the case. One of Deanie's friends also claimed she had told the detective about the conflict between Deanie and the other girls, but it was never followed up on. Whether or not this diary held clues to who hurt Deanie is impossible to say, though it is yet another theory that I've heard elsewhere, especially that the fight that occurred between Deanie and these girls led to someone luring Deanie away from the school that night. Over the years, Deanie's case has never left the minds of her family, her former friends, or her community. She was not forgotten. As I was researching cases to cover for this episode, that was one thing that really stood out. There are pages of articles on her disappearance, an Emmy-winning short documentary, an active Facebook page, and it's in a way uplifting how people have kept Deanie's case alive, because there are other cases that I have looked into or considered covering, and there's nothing. There's no information. There's a couple of articles posted in, the weeks after they vanished, and then nothing for decades. 32 years after Deanie's disappearance, several of her school friends gathered to remember her for the second year in a row. Her childhood friend, Kathy Klingmas, remembered Deanie's contagious laugh and how the girls used to listen to Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell at Deanie's house. Her friends recalled that she had an infectious personality. They meet under a tree that was planted outside a church in memory of Deanie. Another of her friends, Del Todd, said, quote, "We're 45 now, and we've done so much growing, maturing, and living since she disappeared, since we were middle schoolers. And to think back on that time, she's frozen in time as a middle schooler." The friends also shared the lasting trauma of losing one of their own at such a young age, and how Deanie's disappearance has made them more wary of sending their own children into the world. Deanie's mother and stepfather have reconstructed Deanie's bedroom in every home they've lived in since her disappearance. Journalist Brent Ashcroft of WZZM 13 created a brief video that highlighted Deanie's disappearance, which you can find a link to in the show notes. He traveled to Arizona, where Deanie's mother and stepfather were living, so that he could videotape their latest recreation of Deanie's bedroom. It's a rather heart-wrenching thing to see. This 14-year-old girl's room with her hairbrushes and doll collection frozen in time, never giving way to the things she might have eventually hung on the walls: college posters, pictures of high school graduation, images of her transitioning from a child to a woman. In 2017, Vic Weeks, who had retired from the Kent County Sheriff's Department and now ran a private investigation company, opened a P.O. box in Lowell, Michigan, for people to send in anonymous tips about Deanie Peters. As of today, December of 2020, just 2 months shy of the 40-year anniversary of Deanie's disappearance, the people who knew and loved her are still left without answers. So I'm going to shift gears now to talk about the theories surrounding Deanie's disappearance. And I'm going to go back to the initial theory that I talked about that included Bruce Bunch and the idea that she was hit in the school parking lot that evening. So the story, as I have read it, goes something like this. 17-year-old Bruce is in a truck with two of his friends. He hits Deanie in the school parking lot, but somehow there are no witnesses. Apparently there's no sound, at least none that anyone remembers. There's no damage to his truck that anyone reports. There's no glass, blood, or debris left in the parking lot. Then, 17-year-old Bruce and his teenage friends somehow manage to get Deanie into the truck with no evidence left on their clothes. They transport her to a place where the ground is frozen because it's February in Michigan. It's also 5 p.m. when Deanie leaves for the bathroom at the school. So by the time these boys would be disposing of her body, it's probably dark outside. They hide her body and come back later to get rid of it, and none of them ever tells. There's so many aspects to this theory that feel unlikely to me. There are absolutely unsolved cases with hit and runs. In fact, we have a really disturbing one right here in Traverse City that I hope to eventually cover. But in those cases, the driver usually leaves the body behind. In all likelihood, if Deanie was hit in that parking lot, the boys would have driven off. The rumors surrounding this story go so far as to even theorize places where Deanie was buried. And according to some sources, those places, specifically the schoolhouse, came from Bruce Bunch talking about this crime. However, those areas have been searched multiple times, including a Lowell investigator who searched that area in the days after Deanie disappeared, and much larger searches that have been conducted since then. I grew up in a small Michigan town, and rumors can pretty quickly become quote-unquote truths. And there are a lot of cases where we see this, where people were considered the murderers in the community's eyes for years, only to have DNA come in and exonerate them, proving it was a complete stranger, a random guy driving through, whatever. And the accidental hitting just feels like the most unlikely scenario to me. That doesn't mean it's not true. These are simply my opinions after reading what I could find about Deanie Peters' case. That was kind of the conclusion I came to. I just did not find this to be a very believable scenario for what happened to her that night. It takes a massive amount of luck on behalf of the boys who hit her, and a kind of scheming that you don't often see in 17-year-olds. The accidental hitting just feels like the most unlikely scenario to me. Now, that doesn't mean her peers weren't involved. Did a friend lure her into a car that night because of the altercation she'd had days earlier? Maybe someone she knew and trusted. Again, though, this banks on someone she knows encountering her randomly that night at the middle school and deciding to draw her away from the school. Remember, she decided at the last minute to go with her mom to this practice, so it's pretty unlikely anyone knew she'd be there. This theory centers on the idea that several of her peers took her to a separate location, murdered her, and concealed her body. Not only did they manage to do this, but they've also been silent for 40 years. And I'm not talking about the bonfire gossip. I'm talking about one of these kids who grows up and has kids of their own and knows they have to give up the goods on who did this to Deanie. Or, even more likely, one of these kids who in the days after Deanie disappears and there's searches and there's media attention and there's pressure and fear, one of them telling a parent or telling a teacher. This theory relies on a group of young people being essentially silent for decades. And maybe that is plausible when you're young, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but people change. You get older, you have children, you see these petty conflicts that happened in your childhood. You see how insignificant and irrelevant they are. And I just find it hard to believe that multiple people would have been involved in her murder and never came forward to tell someone what happened. And this obviously would not likely be the person who killed her because of the repercussions, but the people who witnessed it or helped conceal her body or whatever. And this theory again relies on there being no eyewitnesses, no one that saw her talking to one of those friends, leaving with one of those friends. Even though these rumors have run rampant, none of them seem to have been validated by the authorities. And it's not for lack of trying. It's clear that the sheriff's department in Kent County has followed up on a lot of these stories, and yet they still have come up empty when it comes to finding any evidence of who took Deanie that night. In terms of the theories and the rumors themselves, there are people who like to boast about committing crimes they haven't committed. There are grown adults who do this, who claim responsibility for murders even. And in this case, we're talking about a rumor that a teenager at a keg party said he did this. So here's what I wonder. Have 5 people from that keg party come forward saying they overheard Bruce Bunch confessing that he hit Deanie that night? Or did one person say they heard this? And then they told 5 of their friends, and 5 of their friends told 5 of their friends. And every time the story got passed along, it was embellished with new details, such as the schoolhouse or the flat river or the pond. And I don't want to imply this isn't possible. And I know that it's possible. There are cases of young people committing horrible crimes and hiding it for years. In fact, Janet Chandler was a 22-year-old woman in the same area that Deanie Peters went missing, who was murdered the year before. And it was decades before the truth of what happened to her emerged. And it was a group of, early 20-something people who had killed her. And these were people that she knew. One of them she was dating, and another one she considered a friend. So again, it's not totally unbelievable. It's just unlikely. And even in Janet's case, these were people who were older than Janet, and they were in their 20s. In the case of Deanie Peters, we're talking about a 14-year-old girl, so maybe 14 up to 18 years old. This is not a sophisticated group of criminals. And just in terms of the rumor aspect, rumors are powerful. There's a reason that gossip is so toxic. It's widespread. Another example that I think of is the murder of Tara Grinstead, and the Up and Vanished podcast covered her murder. And, the reality is that as you're listening to that podcast, which is a deep look into, at that time, an unsolved disappearance. No one knew that Tara had even been murdered. She was a school teacher who had disappeared from her home one night. It turned out that it was someone quite young. It was a former student. I think he was 19 at the time. And he asked his best friend to help him conceal the body. And his friend helped him. And then his friend, drunkenly, at multiple parties in the years after Tara disappeared, told people what had happened. And they either didn't take him seriously, or the ones that did take him seriously and go to law enforcement didn't take them seriously. And when they finally did do that, they ended up finding her body and corroborating the story. But in the case of Deanie Peters, law enforcement has taken these stories seriously, and they have not found any evidence that confirms those rumors. So I want to get into another theory that always makes sense to me. And, we are all biased by our own perceptions of things. So although I know a lot of people feel pretty strongly that Deanie was killed by people she knew, I always think it's important not to discount the possibility that Deanie's disappearance was a stranger abduction. So again, a few things that strengthen this as a possibility for me include the time frame that this happened. It was 1981. There were not cell phones or social media accounts. Deanie drove to the middle school with her mother. She couldn't have texted a friend or her boyfriend on the way, or tagged her location so that the girls she was having issues with would have known where she was. If she'd gotten into a fight in the parking lot that night, someone would likely have seen. There would have been evidence left behind. If she'd been forced into a car with multiple teenagers, how likely is it that A, they disposed of her so completely that a trace has never been found, and B, that they all kept their mouths shut? On the other hand, there are multiple instances of stranger abductions where the victim vanishes and no evidence and no body is found, sometimes not for decades, sometimes never. One of the people that springs to mind in this case for me is Kimberly Leach, who was the final victim of serial killer Ted Bundy. She was abducted outside of her middle school, and the day before he kidnapped her, he had attempted to abduct another teenage girl outside of her school. Schools, especially elementary and middle schools, are places where a predator is guaranteed to come across a potential victim. The circumstances might not always present themselves for this to happen, but if Deanie stepped outside for a cigarette, perhaps walking far enough away from the school to ensure her mother wouldn't see her, she may have become an easy target from someone who was prowling the area. During my research into these kinds of murderers who were at large in Michigan during this time, I came upon a couple of men I will mention. The first was Arthur Ream. Ream is serving life in prison without parole for the 1986 murder of 13-year-old Cindy Zarzicki after he abducted her in East Point. Investigators have been digging up a wooded property that belonged to Ream as they search for other potential victims. In prison, Ream claimed to be a serial killer and said that he's murdered 4 to 6 girls. He was stated as potentially being connected to the disappearance of multiple other girls, including 13-year-old Cynthia Kuhn, who vanished from Washtenaw County on January 19th of 1970, and who was walking to her middle school the morning she was abducted. She's never been found. There were several other girls who were also linked to possibly having been abducted by Ream. In the case of Cindy, the girl he has been convicted of murdering, Ream lured her to a Dairy Queen under the guise that he was throwing a party for his teenage son, who Cindy was dating at the time. Police believe he raped and murdered her before burying her body in Macomb Township. Although Ream lived on the east side of the state, he also traveled to Gladwin and other areas in Michigan. And remember, a lot of these serial murderers are mobile, which is one of the main reasons they can go years and even decades without getting caught. They choose victims in multiple areas. Another person of note is Dennis Bowman. Bowman has been convicted of the 1980 murder of 25-year-old Kathleen Doyle in Norfolk, Virginia. However, his home was in West Michigan, and on May 23, 1980, Bowman ran a young woman on a bike off the road and threatened her with a handgun, telling her to get into the woods. Bowman then shot at the ground by the woman's feet, and she managed to escape, running into the road and flagging down a passing motorist. Bowman was charged with assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct. Though he eventually served time for this assault, court proceedings took nearly 2 years, which left him a free man to murder Kathleen Doyle and also potentially other victims before he was incarcerated in 1982. He's also now been charged with murdering his adopted daughter, 14-year-old Andrea Bowman, who disappeared on March 11, 1989, and had told people before she vanished that Bowman was molesting her. Her skeletal remains were found just this year, buried near Bowman's former home in Allegan County. And I mention him in particular because he was located on the western side of the state. So he was within 50 or 60 miles of where Deanie went missing. And I've also talked about Bowman in another case that happened in northern Michigan because he traveled up north. So again, when you have young women going missing within the same span of time in a same general area, I do think it's important to consider who was at large during that time. I also should mention that I did not read Dennis Bowman or Arthur Ream's names in any articles connected to Deanie Peters. Those are just my own, I don't even want to say theories, but possible theories, I guess, regarding what could have happened to her. So that being said, it's not impossible that her peers did this. It's just not the theory that makes the most sense to me because not a trace of her has been found. To me, that implies that someone lured her or forced her into a vehicle and took her somewhere else, probably somewhere outside of Ada. Likely, I would think this person was alone, and they disposed of her body in a way that would ensure she would likely never be found, which happens often with these serial predators because they learn how to hide the body so they don't get caught. As we come to the end of the Deanie Peters case, I just want to share some information about her and the things she was wearing at the time of her disappearance. So Deanie Peters, again, was 14 years old when she disappeared on February 5th, 1981 from the Forest Hills Central Middle School in Ada, Michigan. She is described as a Caucasian female with brown hair and brown eyes. She has a birthmark on her lower back. Her ears were pierced at the time, and she was known to smoke cigarettes. She was wearing a brown ski jacket, a pink sweater, blue Levi jeans with a length between 27 and 32 inches, a cream-colored scarf with the words ski written in dark-colored lettering, and white knee socks. She was 5'3" tall and 110 pounds. If you have any information regarding the case of Deanie Peters, please contact the Kent County Sheriff's Office at 616-336-3113. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and have a lovely and a safe day. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much, and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.